Welcome to Sewing with Nancy with your host, Nancy Zieman. This how-to videotape is being brought to you by PFAFF, the largest European producer of sewing machines. PFAFF sewing machines and sergers are simply the best. By Pellon, the first name in interfacing and craft material, and the first choice of home sewers for professional results. Pellon products by Freudenberg. By Ginger, a tradition of quality in scissors and shears for home, classroom, and industry. Ginger scissors and shears are the choice of professionals. By the McCall Pattern Company, the most fashionable name in contemporary home sewing patterns and publishers of McCall's Pattern Sewing Fashion magazine. And by Nancy's Notions catalog, featuring specialty sewing books and unique, hard-to-find sewing notions and supplies.
Welcome to Sewing with Nancy. This is a new series entitled Designer Duplicates. My sewing staff and I went on a shopping spree to trendy boutiques and exclusive women's wear shops to buy and look at expensive ready-to-wear. We've chosen or purchased 6 garments, and we're going to show you how to duplicate these ideas at your sewing machine or serger. It's kind of a fun treatment. The first garment we're going to duplicate is a Western style ensemble, skirt and blouse. The blouse is very comfortable, raglan sleeve styling, 100% cotton, but notice the detail is soutache braid, scalloped or scrolled trim along the back and sleeve. It gives it that special designer touch, and that's what I'm going to show you, how to duplicate or copy. I'll also be working with the skirt later on in the program. The blouse alone was $120, and we can work with it, the same fabric, the same pattern style, but sew it for much less and achieve a great looking results as well. I'll get up the sewing machine to show you right now. Working with soutache braid in your sewing machine requires just a little sewing know-how. Let's first of all take a close-up look of our designer blouse. The braid has been put on with a lot of scrolling, and notice it's variegated. That makes it look so great. We could not find variegated braid, so I'm going to give you an alternative for this. And also, when working with the soutache braid, I found I could not make these very sharp corners, so we're going to soften these a little bit. When working with braid that you purchase, I'd like to work with a presser foot in a special way. Either purchase a special foot that's used for attaching trim such as this. It has 2 options for holes to insert very narrow braid such as this, or wider braid in the other hole. And then the braid feeds through the foot very easily. Or if you're working with the foot that comes with your machine, use an embroidery foot, inserting the braid through the top of the hole, the opening where it zigzags, and allowing the braid to come through on the back side, which is hollowed out for your satin stitches. In this case, it'll be hollowed out for the braid. Either way, you'll need to use this kind of special application so that the braid feeds a little bit easier. On the blouse, I used 100% cotton fabric, backed it with a stabilizer that can be torn away, and then with a marking pen, drew some lines for my scrolling or the attaching of the braid. I'll snap on my foot, and again I have a zigzag stitch set up on my machine. And do a practice run of this before you actually sew it on your fabric, and just sew. And you don't really have to guide it because the little foot opening does that for you. It takes a few minutes of time to work on, and as I'm finding, it's a little bit easier to do if you have some sharp corners to stop and reposition your braid. Now I'm using contrasting thread. At home, I would recommend using monofilament thread that obviously you cannot see, or matching thread to the braid. And just keep sewing. Just turn the fabric. I don't have the most beautiful stitching here because I have blue thread on red braid, but here's some stitching I did earlier, and you can see it gives a very attractive look. But it isn't variegated. If you were trying to duplicate exactly what the designer had in mind when working with this blouse, you could work with variegated thread as opposed to variegated braid. I'm going to put on my embroidery foot, remove my top thread, and thread my machine with variegated thread. Usually found in the embroidery section of your sewing center or catalog. The braid, the thread, I'm going to work with is in the primary colors. And again, I'm going to work with a satin stitch and shorten my stitch length. And I'm going to go to about a 0.5, a short stitch length. Now the setup on my fabric, on this one I could duplicate the design almost exactly. By doing this, I traced the design on a stabilizer and outlined it. This is a clear washable type of stabilizer. Placed it on my fabric and then again back the fabric with a tearaway stabilizer. And now I'm simply going to satin stitch. And this is how we created the designer duplicate that you'll see in just a few minutes. Test again, checking out your width of the stitch that you'd like to use, and simply guide the fabric following the design. I have my machine set at a medium width. I think that's easier to maneuver on all these corners than if you were working with a very wide stitch. And try to be as accurate as possible. We're getting a mirror image here. We have what's on one side is exactly on the other, so I want to be very accurate if possible. I've slightly loosened the top tension to a buttonhole setting. I've gone from a number 5 to a number 3 so that my satin stitches would look very full. Let me show you on the finished garment how we achieved the duplicate look. Not exactly, but quite similar with the variegated thread compared to a soutache braid, a simple designer touch. To complete our Western style ensemble, I'd like to show you some of the details on the skirt. It's an extra wide channel stitched waistline, about 3.5 or 3 1/4 inches wide. There are extra tabs placed around the waistline for detail. There's a unique construction idea on the back. The zipper extends up into the waistline, locking at the fold at the top of the waistline. You'll have to eliminate putting on the hooks and eyes at the top of the waistline. I think it's a nice, clean finish. I think you'll like this idea. First of all, I'd like to show you how to work with the channel stitched waistline. As I mentioned, this is a wide waistline, about 3 1/4, 3 1/2 inches wide, whatever you'd like. Using your favorite gathered skirt pattern, cut the waistband, the length that's on the pattern, but make the width 4 1/2 inches wide, 4 1/2 inches wide, and you're going to cut 2. Generally, we just have 1 waistband piece. Notice that I have interfacing on one of the waistband pieces, and it's an extra stiff interfacing. You need it stiff to provide strength and stability for the channel stitching. Simply straight rows of stitching about 1/4 inch apart. We've used contrasting thread on this sample for you, but you could use matching thread to your fabric if you'd like. Notice that the stitching starts 1 inch from each long edge, 1/4 inch apart. This will allow space for the 5/8 inch seam allowances and will give you the finished look of just channel stitching. When channel stitching, I like to use 2 threads. 2 threads of your contrasting or matching color. And to accommodate 2 threads very easily through your machine, try working with a top stitching needle. It's the same size as your regular needle, but the eye is longer and wider to accommodate 2 threads. If you use a traditional needle, it may not work as easily, so try a top stitching needle for this special look. At the machine, you can see that I'm top stitching a presser foot width away from my initial stitching. It's about 1/4 inch, just row after row of long stitches to give this specialty look. The tabs were another nice detail that the designer added to this waistband, and we have the tabs started to put on the waistline, but I'd like to show you the size to make them. You're kind of creating your own pattern, so you might have to work a little bit of trying to get the right size. Here we found that 4 1/2 inches wide by 5 1/2, 4 1/2 by 5 1/2. Cut 4 of these and interface each piece. Sew together with 1/4 inch seam allowance, just a narrow seam allowance. Press the seam open and then displace the seam. Put it not at the edge or not in the middle, but somewhere offset. To get the tabs points formed, I've simply just used my ruler, placing it at a 90-degree angle, or 45-degree angle I should say, to get 45-degree edges on each side, and marked it with a pen and stitched. When you turn it right side out, you have cute tabs. Simple and fast to put together. Cut 4 of these, and sew 4 of these. Notice the seam is offset out of your way when having the bulk of the fabric. Now on your waistband, you'll have markings, and I have marked with a washable marking pen my side seam marking. Usually it's a little square on the pattern piece. To get the placement of the tabs from measuring our designer original, I found that by measuring 2.5 to 3 inches from each side of the side seam gave me the correct placement. Put one here and measure 2.5 to 3. Now this will depend upon your waistline size. You may want to spread them apart, put them closer together, but the idea is to have 4 tabs around the waistline. Place this waistband around your waistline to see if it fits. If it does, then sew the waistbands together, meeting the top long edges, meeting the right sides, and then you can do the traditional grading and understitching, so you have a double waistband. Now gather the skirt fabric to meet the waistband. And the only idea that I would like to share with you on this, or one of the specialty points I'd like to point out, is that please do not gather 1 inch on each side at the center back. You see, the waistband is put on prior to the zipper for this treatment. And to make top stitching easier, we'd like this flat, a 1-to-1 ratio of fabric to the waistband. So on both sides, it's gathered except for the center back seam on each side. You'll find top stitching that zipper to go so much easier. After you've gathered the waistband to the skirt, grade the seam allowances, grading the waistband seam allowance the narrowest, and then press the waistband seam allowance up, and you're ready to put in the zipper. Now I'm ready to insert the zipper. Usually we put the zipper in before the waistband. Remember, this time the zipper is going to extend to the top of the waistband. Off camera, I finished stitching the center back seam of the sample. I used a basting stitch in the zipper area. Stitch to the top of the waistband, left the underside of the waistband unstitched. Then press open the seam so that we can put in the center zipper. And in the one side of the seam allowance, I placed a double-sided basting tape. It's kind of shiny. This is available either in 1/4 of an inch or 1/8 of an inch wide. Both sides are adhesive. You peel off, place it down, then peel off the paper backing so that the zipper can be pinned into place, quote unquote, without actually using pins. Then position the zipper in the seam allowance, meeting the right side of the zipper to the seam allowance area. I like to purchase a zipper a little bit longer because it's a wide zipper waistband, or wide waistband I should say. Placing the zipper stop about 1/4 of an inch below the top of the waistband. Close the zipper. I'm going to open this seam allowance, got it stuck together, and position this so that the right side of the zipper is down and everything is centered. Take a little time to position this because the tape is holding this in place for you. Then from the right side, you can use another sewing hint to make your top stitching more accurate. Use 1/2 of an inch wide tape, the type you use to wrap presents or sewer's tape that's 1/2 inch wide. And again, center this like you centered the zipper so that there's about 1/4 of an inch on each side of the seam allowance. This will be your sewing guide. It will come off as soon as you finish the top stitching. I'm going to sew across the bottom, sew up the side. Cut my threads, sew across the bottom and up the side. Sewing from bottom to top will make sewing that zipper much more accurate. My machine set for a traditional straight stitch. Make sure all the fabric is out of the way. And sew. Stopping with the zipper, stopping with the foot at the corner of the tape, pivoting, and now just following the zipper tape, sewing along the side. And the zipper tape, this tape I should say, 1/2 inch tape, makes it so much easier to have accurate stitching lines. At the top, take a little time because that zipper tab is in the way to make certain that you'll get an accurate stitching. Lock your seams and you're ready to sew the other side. On my sample, I have finished sewing both sides of the zipper and then opened the seam allowance of the zipper so that you can see it's completely finished. It's nice and neat, and we don't have to worry about putting on hook and eyes. From the back side, the unfinished side of the waistband, you will turn under the seam allowance and meet it to the zipper tape. Usually you'll turn under about 3/4 of an inch, a little bit more than 5/8. And as on this side, top stitch, or hand stitch I should say, the facing of the waistband in place. There's one last finishing step. That is, the seam allowances of the waistband have to be covered. From the right side, pin the back of the waistband in place all around the waistline, including the tabs. The tabs need to be attached. Then stitch in the ditch, stitching in the well of the seam, sewing from the right side in the well so that you catch the back of the waistband and the tabs. And here you can see the finished look on the back side, nice and neat and clean. Well, on our skirt that we made, we used those same techniques, and here you can see the finished product. The Western style top, blouse, and of course the skirt, all made with these ideas. Working with the satin stitching on the blouse and the channel stitch waistband and specially finished skirt zipper closing. And here's the original. You can see we have a designer duplicate with ease. All it needs is a little sewing know-how and applying your sewing skills with your machine. Our next designer original has very interesting applications on it, things from the past. This is a very simple style jacket, but notice how it is embellished with doilies, antique buttons, and lace trim, something that you can easily do at home. We'd like to start off with some lace trimmings. You may have some at home in a drawer. You may have crocheted or tatted some embellishments that aren't being used right now, and you can put them together in a jacket. I have some combinations of old lace that was on a pillowcase, some doilies that were made by my grandmother, and this is what we used for our copy, or our duplicate, to make our original. Now notice that these colorations are not the same. If you'd like these laces and trims to be on an heirloom type of jacket, you may like to tea dye them, place them in a bath of hot water and tea, check them every few minutes to see if they're getting kind of a comparable color. But sometimes slight shadings are very pleasant to look at. The jacket that we have, we made out of linen. The original was out of rayon, so we have even a little more special type of jacket. And we copied some of the collar treatments, and I'd like to show you on the original. Along the collar and the upper welt pocket, there's some lace trimming. We couldn't find a lace trimming exactly like this, but we kind of did some modifications. I purchased some lace, and the lace was actually quite shiny. It was a rayon lace, so we flipped to the back side. This is the back side that you see. The right side is a little bit more lustrous. And rather than using the points of the lace, we just enclosed the points into the seam allowance, just top stitching it along so it looked more like a lace trim. You don't have to use all of the lace area. We included this at the edge of the upper collar and the lower pocket area. But the fun part was playing with the lace doilies and the antique buttons. You can either hand stitch or machine stitch these into wherever you'd like them placed. I just love these buttons that go along with it. And also put a touch of a doily coming out of a pocket with a few buttons, mother of pearl buttons at each edge. One thing we found from our original design was the unique placement of the button. I just like this technique quite well. From my grandmother's sewing box, I found this very large button, but you'd have to have a huge buttonhole to accommodate this. Rather than making such a large buttonhole, we simply back the button with a smaller one. And this is what buttoned through the jacket. Then on the underneath side, we also have a smaller button. So we're working the buttonhole with that smaller button. We don't have to have that large buttonhole. Here's our duplicate. You can see Karen wearing the duplicate with great charm and appeal. It's fun to wear this jacket, reminiscent of days gone by. The designer original looks very comparable to this, and we just pulled out specific details that we wanted to copy. I hope you'll try this idea sometime in the future. In our first program of designer duplicates, I gave you some ideas of working with a Western outfit, the soutache braid applied to a cotton blouse on the sleeve and back area, as well as making the designer skirt, wide waistband, unique zipper construction, and then that great reminiscent jacket with the doilies and the antique buttons. You know, what's nice about sewing is that you can kind of glean this information from the designers, but then apply your sewing know-how and knowledge and get a better product. This skirt was $130. And we got the great ideas from this, but we didn't always find the best construction detail. There's some raw edges along this area. And the way we made this skirt, by enclosing the raw edges with the back of the waistband, everything on the inside is neat and clean, and you will not have that bulk in this area. So we not only used the ideas, but then we applied a little bit of our sewing knowledge in advance. Next time in Designer Duplicates, I'll be showing you great ideas with jackets, a confetti jacket like I'm wearing. I'll show you that in a few minutes. Thanks for joining me. This is the second part of our series on designer duplicates, where I'm showing you how to copy and glean ideas from designers and apply them to your patterns and fabrics at home. Today we're going to be working with two jackets, a woven jacket and a knit style. First of all, the woven jacket. Our model Karen is wearing this great looking jacket. We call it a confetti appliqué jacket, where the suede appliques are randomly strewn down the shoulder and lapel area. There's also a great piping detail around the shawl collar and around each pocket. Very tastefully done. When you see the jacket from the inside, you'll also see that they used a contrasting facing application in the back. Another great designer touch. So we'll be copying many of these inspirations and applying them to fabric that I have or you may have at home. It's fun to sew when you can use ideas plus your sewing know-how. I'll get it set up at the table right now. When this designer original is off your body, you'll find some kind of fun details. Not only does it have the applique and the piping, but the back facing is of another fabric and it's extended, so it looks great both on and off your figure. We're going to take this one step further and do another change to the front facing, because inside the jacket you'll find that the shoulder pad is still visible. Well, if we'd only extend the front facing, we could hide this. On our copy, we've used slightly different fabric, a little bit different interpretation, but still some of the same ideas. The facing is extended at the back, but also is extended at the front so that it comes into the armhole area. And notice that shoulder pad is hidden. I've shown this on other Sewing with Nancy programs many years ago, but never used a contrasting fabric for the back. I think that adds a fun detail. For the back facing, rather than having that small little shape at the neckline, we have a facing that encompasses the neckline, the shoulder seam, and half of the back. So this is quite a big piece of fabric in comparison to the traditional size. For the front facing, I've pinned the front facing to the front jacket. Now this is a shawl collar, that's why it has this extension at the upper collar, but I've matched the notches at the shoulder seam. This facing needs to be extended the entire length of the shoulder and half of the armhole facing. And I'll show you the finished facing. It's just a little bit larger than the first one, extending so that it will cover that shoulder area. You can see it's wider and longer and then blends back into the original facing line. So that's how to make it so that it has a little extra color in the back facing and also hides that shoulder pad. Construct your jacket using a flat construction idea. That means not sewing things into circles. The sleeve is not sewn into circles. It's stitched into the armhole flat. Obviously the shoulder seams have been stitched and the undercollar has been attached so that basically it's together. You can then kind of put this on your figure and pin where you'd like some appliques. Our designer original used synthetic suede as the applique and backed the fabric with a fusible web, and that's exactly what we're going to do. You may want to buy an applique fabric that's in a bag of swatches or scraps, or just a designer cut, because this is kind of expensive. But then fuse these scraps or the large cuts to a fusible back paper web. We kind of made a puzzle out of this, just took sections and fused it to the adhesive part, and it has the paper backing. Now generally you can draw your design on the paper backing, or since these were very geometric, we simply just cut out sections. Made some little bolts of lightning or some triangles, whatever you'd like to use, just kind of cut out sections from this area. And then peel off the paper backing. and place these appliques on your figure. We've already have a few pinned into place. We're positioning kind of the confetti type of applique wherever you'd like them. It went down the jacket, both front and back, so place it wherever you'd like. On the facing, while this is on your figure, kind of fold the collar and just place it not on the facing itself, but on the shawl collar and pin where you'd like this to be placed. So you get this kind of fun, joyous jacket. Then fuse or press the applique pieces to your jacket, covering the applique with a damp press cloth. You can sew around the edges in one of two ways. On the original, it was straight stitched around the edges. You see, by not having the sleeve or the underarm seam stitched, you can get in here and stitch around the very edges. What we did on our jacket was a little bit different. We used monofilament thread, the clear thread, and used a blind hem stitch to stitch around the edge so it looked more hand-picked. The blind hem stitching is a straight stitch and then a zigzag, and that's what we did around the edge, so that you have this option. It's a fun treatment to add to a casual jacket. The piping detail around this jacket is much easier than it looks. Here are the few guidelines. Cut bias strips that are 1 5/8 to 1 3/4 inches wide. I'll give you the reasoning for this exact measurement in just a few seconds. This is about 1 5/8 inches wide, and cut many strips, seaming them together so that you'll have 3 to 4 yards of piping. Place the cording in the center on the wrong side and sandwich the two edges, meeting the lengthwise edges. We're going to be sewing right next to this cording. I believe that the foot is the real key of working with this. You need a piping foot or a single bulky knit foot. They're called many names, but it has a hollowed out section on the underneath side, allowing a large piece of cording or piping to follow in that groove. I have a comparable foot already put on my machine, and I've already tested this out so that as I'm sewing the cording, the needle is going to fall right next to the cording, sandwiching it in there very securely. Notice I'm trying to match those cut edges exactly. Match these cut edges. The ultimate idea is that the seam allowance width, the distance between the stitching and the cut edge, is 5/8 of an inch. That will give you an accurate piping application. For the pocket, I have the piping started at the hemline. I have a little notch or clip in my pocket right at the hemline, and I've angled it off the pocket, but then I'm going to put the cut edge of the piping next to the cut edge of the pocket. Again, I'll have that 5/8 of an inch seam line, and I'm going to start at off the pocket and then immediately taper this onto the pocket, matching all these cut edges. And you'll do this all the way around, and you'll be surprised how easy this goes around a corner. And I'm just doing part of this for you, but you would sew all the way around the edge, and notice what a great finish this gives. To finish the hemline, fold the hem back on itself and turn it right side out. And your pocket is ready to top stitch to the garment, and you'll sew in the well of the seam in the ditch to top stitch it into place. And that's a great designer detail. The edge of the jacket has piping as well. It goes around the shawl collar, stopping and starting at the buttonhole area. I've started to pin the piping to my jacket area, again matching the cut edges. And here I have a marking where the buttonhole line ends and starts, and that's why the piping veers off to the right. Sandwich all these layers together. I have the pin heads pointing outward so that I can easily pin all these layers together. Now the piping isn't attached to the jacket yet, so now I've started to sew this off camera, I'll continue my seam, and I have the piping in the groove of the foot. Since I have a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance on the piping, I know I'm getting a 5/8 of an inch seam, and I'll just sew around the edge. This is what's so marvelous because all layers are put together at the same time, and the piping is sandwiched in the middle. Now when I turn this right side out, this is a great detail. Here we have the piping sandwiched between the shawl collar and the under collar, and what a great finish this gives. Well, now you can see the finished garments, both the original and the duplicate, and they both have great class and charm. The piping around the edges, again, stopping above the button, going around the shawl collar, and around the pocket edge. The confetti type appliqué, whether it's top stitched into place or using your blind hem stitch to put it in place, it has great detail. And of course, try a change of facings that you'll see from the inside. I hope you'll give these jackets a try. Our next designer inspiration comes from a knit collection. Tanya is wearing this great looking rust outfit with black piping trim around the edges and also around the waistline and cuffs. Notice that the waistline and cuffs have a kind of a collar type fabric, and that's what we're going to use to copy this original. I'm going to be working with a darker fabric. Our original copy design has different coloration. Actually, I like it a little bit better than the original, with dark fabric, black, and royal trim. And along the lower edge, I've used collars to have the waistband treatment. It's kind of a fun look and easy to put together. You'll need to choose a pattern that has many of the same details. You probably can't find all the details on a pattern, but look for some of the more important ones. For example, in this pattern we chose the shawl collar, double-breasted, and then we're just going to make some pattern modifications to get the designer look. First of all, the trim. The trim was cut out of knit fabric, 1 inch cut across the grain. So we have 60 inches of trim just by cutting a 1 inch piece across the grain of the fabric. And we're going to place this around the edge of the collar. Since this is knit, it needs some stability, and the stability I'm going to use is the fusible web that has a paper backing. We used this earlier for the confetti appliqué. Here I've just used the roll of web that you can purchase by the roll, fused it to the wrong side of the strip, and then you peel off the backing. This allows the strip to be somewhat stable but also fusible so that these edges will stick together to form the trim. To get very even trim, I'm using a bias tape maker, a 1/2 inch size, and I've already started this. I threaded the wide end of the tape through the wide end of the maker, advancing it through this slot, and when it comes out, it's folded. Well, not quite exactly this neat, but that's why we have the fusible web attached to it. Pull out about 1/2 inch, press. Just go a little bit at a time. This is a knit, so it stretches, so that's why you kind of have to go 1/2 inch by 1/2 inch. And let me just repress this and do the 60-inch length of your trim to get it nice and even. That's the trim, and it's very simple to put on. It's simply edge stitched around. And to put it on very easily, we've constructed this jacket with a flat idea, the same way that we worked with the earlier jacket in today's program, by setting in the sleeve without stitching the underarm. So it's a flat construction, and the underarm seam hasn't been stitched. That allows you to work flat at your machine to sew the piping around the collar. The collar facing has been put on, not finished, just put on around the edges. And on this finished sample, you can possibly see how we place the tape right next to the stitching line, and then using matching thread stitched right along each fold, 1/8 inch from one side and 1/8 inch from another. Really, it went on quite quickly. And if we take an overview of this jacket, we can see that even though we have the piping or the trim on the inside, it is on the underneath of the shawl collar and then comes uppermost. And it's a nice, even trim put on without a lot of expense or time. When looking at ready-to-wear, you'll find that manufacturers have the great opportunity of specially weaving or knitting coordinate fabrics, and we don't always have that advantage. For example, on this knit jacket, the waistband area has a special stretchy ribbing that coordinates exactly to the fashion fabric. It's one entire length of fabric without any seaming, and we just can't buy fabric exactly like that. But we can kind of make some modifications, and that's what we did when copying this original. Rather than looking for exact ribbing that would match, as I mentioned earlier, we used knit collars for the lower edge. 3 collars to be exact, two for the jacket, 1 for the back, and the second was split on either side of the front, and the third was split for each sleeve. Now you may have to change the length of these collars just a little bit, but I think it gives it that great accent that so often we miss when we're able to sew because we just can't find the fabric. So we'll just make some modifications. When making this jacket, I did not make the cutout sections for the waistband ribbing until I had kind of sewn the shoulder seams and set in the sleeves so that I could get the proper fit. And then check where I'd like that waistband, that collar waistband, to be placed. Here's my pattern. And I've worked with this just a little bit. As you can see, I split one set of collars, cutting it in half. And you may not need all this extra length. That's why I pinned under this section and kind of placed it on my figure where I would like this to be extended. I wanted to keep, in the buttonhole section, wanted to keep both double-breasted buttons without any ribbing. I wanted that to be nice and flat fabric. So about 1 inch after the button, then I started to have my sewing line. Notice that I have two lines, one where I'd like the finished edge, and the second allowing a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. When you're doing some gleaning from designers, you're not going to have pattern guide sheets, so you have to kind of compromise or make up your sewing steps as you go along, and that's what we're doing right now, just kind of giving you these ideas. So this is the cutout section for this particular collar, or waistband I should say. For the back of the jacket, it was just one entire piece, so I just cut that length shorter. And what I'd like to show you now at the sewing machine is how to put these bands to the lower edge and get that nice sharp mitered corner where the two fabrics meet. The sewing detail that I'd like to show you is getting that mitered corner by placing the ribbing as an inset to the jacket. Easy to put it around the back waistline in the cuff, but there's just a little detail needed to have it as the inset. On each jacket front where you've cut away the section, do some stay stitching, some stabilizing sewing, sewing it along the seam line, pivoting and then sewing along the edge so that we have this corner reinforced. I've already clipped to the stitching line because that's where I'm going to be doing the turning. On the collar inset, which is now going to become the waistband, I've placed a pin at the seam allowance intersection, 1/4 of an inch from the lengthwise edge, 1/4 of an inch from the top edge. This pin point and the point on the garment, at the corner of the garment, must meet. Meet right sides together, and I'm simply going to pin the corners on top of each other and sew together. Sewing just the lengthwise edge first of all. Using the 5/8, or excuse me, we're using a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, sewing along that stay stitching line. And where I'm going to stop is right at the corner. And you may want to lock your threads. Then after clipping this, we're going to sew the outer edge, or the top edge really, and I'm going to swing or pivot this top edge to meet the collar. I'm going to stretch the collar band to meet the jacket. I've cut this a little bit shorter so that it would give some stretch, and now sew across the top. So I'm sewing this in 2 steps. I'll get it started first of all, and now just stretch the collar to meet the jacket. And soon we'll see how I've done on my sewing. When I turn this right side out, hopefully you'll see an accurate corner. And sure enough, that's what we have. By sewing first the long edge and then the top edge and stay stitching that area, we have a sharp corner. Now sew the side seams, attaching the front to the back, put the cuff on the area, and do the final finishing touches. Here's Tanya in our duplicate. It has a great look, different colorations than the original, but the same styling and accents. The trim around the neckline is very easy to accomplish by cutting 1-inch strips along the cross grain of knit fabric and stitching to the collar. The waistline treatment, of course, are those knit collars that are sewn together, just like ribbing. I hope you'll give this one a try. In our second program of this series on duplicates, designer duplicates, I detailed working with a lot of creative ideas, and I'd like to review working with the piping. start with a bias strip that's about 1 5/8 to 1 3/4 inches wide. The exact width will depend upon the size of the cording used. Fold that cording in the middle with wrong sides together and stitch along the cording. Now you could use a zipper foot, but what I found working so well with this idea is to use a creative foot called pearls and piping, allowing me to sew right next to that edge because the grooved out section of the foot follows the cording area, leaving a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance from the stitching line to the very cut edge. And this is why you want a very accurate strip width. When placing the cording along the pocket edge, use the same foot, and you'll sew along that initial line, giving you a completed edge that looks so neat and professional. This is a designer detail that I'm sure many of you can use. I'm so glad that you could join me. This is the third program of my series on designer duplicates, where we've purchased ready-to-wear and to show you the original and then the duplicate. The first part of this program, I'm going to show you kind of how to interpret ready-to-wear, not that we have to follow it line for line or color for color, but we can use an idea and then our own fabric collection to make what we like for ourselves. This is our original. It's a tuxedo outfit with a blouse and vest combined. Roberta is wearing this great-looking outfit, perfect for holiday wear, evening wear. Notice that the vest is attached to the blouse at the shoulder seams and at the underarm. There isn't a back to the vest. It's a combo of a blouse and vest in one. I'm going to use this idea in the first part of our program, but we're not exactly going to use the same coloration. Different fabrics and a different look, but a great designer detail. The second half of this program, we're going to work with pattern design ideas and applying them to a new pattern. We'll get set up at the table right now. When working with ready-to-wear, many times you'll just be using portions of the designer ideas for your project. Let's take a closer look at our original and show you the portion that I'm going to use. As I mentioned earlier, the vest is attached to the shoulder seam and the side seam so that it is one unit. There isn't a completed vest back, but they tried to simulate that look by having a facing that's exposed. The facing is of white attached to the back of the jacket to make this look like a vest back. Well, we are going to not use that facing technique. It kind of takes a little bit more time than I wanted. I want a more casual look. Instead, I've simply added the vest to the front of the blouse at the shoulder and at the side seam, but I used a solid blouse back. You can combine whatever idea that you'd like, but this was the idea that I went with. When working with a pattern, you need a blouse that has shirt tails and a vest pattern. Luckily, this one happened to have both elements as one. Regardless of if you're using one pattern or combining one or two, the cutting directions are very simple. You're going to cut one blouse. We use the purple fabric in this instance, and then just fronts from the vest pieces. We did not have to cut the back pieces. The construction is simple because we're not constructing the back, we're combining the vest and blouse as one. Your vest pattern will either have a facing or it will be lined. In this instance, we're working with a lined vest front. So I have actually 4 vest fronts, 2 for the left and 2 for the right side. I have fusible interfacing placed on one side of the vest front. If your pattern called for a facing, please put fusible interfacing on the facing. Pin the cut edges together, and we're going to sew or serge the edges, and I'll give you a fast construction idea for putting the vest fronts together. Your next step is to sew the armhole seam in the center front area. Rather than sewing it in a continuous seam in the center front, I'm going to sew it in 4 short seams. Traditionally, we would sew the center front area, pivot at the vest point, sew down the front, pivot at the hem, and then again at the V point at the hemline. Instead, we're going to sew each section by itself, and then I'll show you how to wrap the corners. Off camera, I've already stitched one of the samples, the first row stitching, sewing from the shoulder seam to the first traditional pivot point. Rather than pivoting, I stitched right off the fabric edge. And we've worked with this technique on collars, but here we're going to use it on the points of this vest. I've graded the seam allowances and pressed the seam allowances toward the lining, the part with the interfacing. Now I'm going to understitch this entire seam, sewing from the cut edge to cut edge. When understitching, I rather like to work with the multiple zigzag or the serpentine stitch, and I'm using the serpentine stitch right now. I think it gives a flatter edge, more concentration of stitches, and the seams lie flatter. By understitching in this manner, you can stitch from cut edge to cut edge, whereas you couldn't in the traditional manner. Now to do the wrap corner treatment, on the fold of the fabric, we're going to fold it right along that stitching line. Here's where I had the stitching line, and the fabric is folded in this area. Notice the seam allowance is pressed to the back side. Now I'm simply going to stitch from the fold to the next pivot point, sewing directly off the fabric. Now I'll set my machine back for a straight stitch. You can finger pin this or pin it with traditional pins. I'm just going to quickly finger pin, start sewing at the fold of the fabric, and then sew one whole entire edge again. So we're not pivoting. When I get to this edge, I'm simply going to sew off the fabric. Grade your seam allowances, grading the the undervest, the lining of the vest, narrower than the outer vest. This is lightweight fabric, so I'm just going to trim for now the lining section, grading it to about 3/8 of an inch. And you can generally do this a little bit more accurate when you're working on a flatter surface. And now I'm going to press this. Pressing in 2 steps is what I like to do. Pressing it flat, the way you stitched it, and then press it in the direction that you're going to be stitching for the understitching. Pressing it the way the seam has been stitched. And now I'm going to use a presser point. I feel that works a little bit better. We will not leave ridges on the right side by pressing the seam allowance toward the lining of the vest. And now the next step, as before, would be to do the understitching. Understitching from the point, the unfinished point, to the sewn point. And you can practically sew right to the very edge. Now the magic comes with this. By turning this right side out, you would finish sewing all the outer edges around the hem to the underarm seam. But the nice part about doing the wrap corners is that you get such very sharp corners because you sew it step by step rather than having the bulk in the area of the corners. You've already graded and trimmed that. You're going to be working, as I said, sewing the armhole, the center edges, including the hems, leaving the shoulder seam open and the underarm seam open. If you'd like, on this garment, this vest front, you could do the edge stitching around the armhole and the outer edges. That's an optional treatment. Another optional way of sewing this is sewing it on a serger, and I'd like to show you that right now. If you're a serger owner, you can serge this vest in a quicker period of time than actually sewing it. The serging saves 1 step, and I'd like to show you that. The idea is in the setup, and that will give you the time-saving element. I'm working with a 3/4 thread serger. I'm using all-purpose thread in the needles and in the upper looper, but in the lower looper, I have the thread fuse, the fusible type of thread that adheres to fabric when steam and heat are applied. That's put in the lower looper. It's important when you're serging the seam that fusible thread is on the underneath side, on the facing or lining piece. So as I'm serging the sections, we'll serge it from cut edge to cut edge and not pivoting as with the sewing machine. Notice that I have the interface side on the next to the feed dog, so that will get the fusible type of thread. I'm guiding the fabric so that the needle, the left needle, is sewing at the 5/8 of an inch seam. And I'll just sew from one cut edge to the other cut edge. The serger is trimming off the excess seam allowances, so I don't have to worry about that. Notice I like to put my pins on parallel to the cut edge so I don't make a mistake by serging over them. And just sew section by section. When I show you the back side of this seam, you'll maybe slightly be able to see this white fusible thread. It's a little bit heavier than the normal thread. I did slightly tighten the tension so that it would not peek up to the right side. Now at the ironing board, I'm pressing the seam allowance toward the lining section. And the fusible type of thread adheres to that piece of fabric, eliminating the step of understitching. Then when it's time to do the next row of sewing, you're going to start sewing from the fold and continue serging and pressing until the outer edge is complete. Now align the cut edge of the vest at the shoulder and the underarm seam of your blouse. And then you're ready to complete the blouse as the pattern direction states. Roberta is modeling our finished designer duplicate, combining the vest and blouse together. I just love the combination of fabrics, the rich hues of the purple blouse and the southwest print of the vest. When comparing it to the original, you can see both looks are very dynamic, and we've done a little interpretation combining the two. I hope you'll consider using this idea in one of your next sewing projects. Next, you'll see a designer outfit that was from a pattern. There are many designer and great ideas in the pattern envelope and in pattern books, and that's what you'll see next. Marcy's suit is a great green silk tweed with an Ultrasuede collar, a great designer original. The best part about it is the easy mock welt pocket. I'm going to show you how to transfer that simple construction idea from one pattern to the next. You know, so often when I ask someone what pattern number they're wearing, they say, well, it's a sleeve from one pattern and the collar from another, and they combine many different patterns. And I'm sure that you have thought of this or have done this yourself. But there are some basic guidelines to follow, and I'd like to point those out to you. When referring to this jacket, we're not going to go necessarily step by step through the changes of this collar. It's just basically putting the seam in a different place, but I'll show you some of the guidelines that I like to use for this equestrian style shaping. When transferring patterns, it's nice if you can use the same pattern size, especially if it's from the same pattern company. Pieces will jive a little bit better. I have two shawl collar patterns, one on top of the other, the hemline meeting, and the grain lines, if you could see through the pattern pieces, are running parallel to each other. They're not necessarily stacked on top of each other, they're parallel in this instance so that the grain and the shape would go in the same direction. The outer edges may not be even, and that's not necessary. It's more important that the grains are parallel, and I'd mark my new sewing line right along this area. I'd split my pattern in two and add seam allowances, and then I'd get that quick shape with just a little bit of extra work. Now the mock welt pocket has a few more details to it, and many patterns that you'll be copying will also have several details to them. Let me show you the original designer pattern. One of my favorites to work with. Instead of a welt pocket having separate small little pieces called lips that we usually stitch to the area, we're simply going to fold under the hemline and edge stitch, which I'll show you in a few minutes, about 1/4 of an inch from the fold, creating the lips of the welt pocket. It will go together so quickly. But you can see the shape of the top of the jacket and the lower section of the jacket. We need to transfer that to the other pattern piece. For this particular jacket idea, you'll need two seams, a princess style seam, or in this jacket that we're going to work with right now, it has a long vertical dart, a dart from the hemline to the bust line. Because of the two seaming, in essence, the dart is like a seam. We could make this mock welt pocket in this pattern. I'll put it back together again, but you can see this long vertical dart, extended dart. I simply cut the pattern along the dart line, and then I've marked where my line will be for the pocket. In order to do this, I simply again placed the pattern pieces one on top of the other, making certain that the grain lines were parallel. And I can see through this. I realize that you possibly can't, but they're parallel with each other. And that's what gave me the placement line for my pocket. But unfortunately, it's just not by adding a 1/2 inch or 5/8 of an inch seam allowance that will finish this. We need a little bit more of a shaping. So I did some transferring. I placed some tissue paper on top of my original pattern piece of the upper side and the lower side of the front. So I would have those two shapes, and then move it over to my new pattern. Now what I found is that my new pattern wasn't as wide as the older pattern. So you can simply split the two, or split it down the center, and align the fold line to the pattern piece and pin or tape. And the same on the other side, making sure that the cut edges are matching up. So that was a simple transfer. You tape it down a little bit more securely. To work with the lower edge, did the same thing. Split my new adaptation parallel to the grain line. Oop, I'm putting it on my original. Let me put it onto the change pattern. Matching it on both ends, and I'll have to do a little overlap. This pattern will be wide enough for a pocket. My hand fits in this area. And then you do this, make the same change to the inset pocket, the lining pieces, which I'll show you in a minute. But right now, when cutting this out, I would have one section for the lower band, and the upper side would be attached right to my pattern piece. Cut out your pattern pieces, and now I'll show you how to sew that pocket in just a few minutes. The best thing about copying a design from a pattern and transferring it to another pattern is that we'll have the pattern guide sheet to follow. That's not a luxury we have when purchasing or looking at ready-to-wear and then trying to copy that. I'd like to show you the instructions of putting in this mock welt pocket that we found in the pattern guide sheet. They're simple, and I'd show you the very basics. When working with the pocket, on the lower portion of the jacket, I've pressed the pocket along the fold line, forming the lower lip of the pocket. And I've already stitched the pocket lining in place. Notice that the seam allowances are pressed downward. On my original pattern, the pocket was just a little bit narrower, or is narrower on this new pattern than on the original, so I simply folded under the excess tissue and cut out my new pattern pieces. On the jacket top, the part that's connected to this particular jacket, again, the top of the pocket, I pressed the fold line of the upper pocket and added the pocket lining itself. Along the fold line of both of these pocket sections, I'm going to stitch 1/4 of an inch from the fold. Now generally, a presser foot width is 1/4 of an inch wide, or there'll be markings on your foot for that particular width. Find where 1/4 of an inch marking is from your needle, and top stitch or edge stitch 1/4 of an inch, and that creates the lips of the pocket. Traditionally, when working with this, you have to add small little sections. Well, this is why this is such a great technique. So again, I'll do 1/4 of an inch from the fold along the lower edge of this pocket. You would not use white thread on red fabric, but you'll still get a very nice edge, and it gives the kind of the pseudo edge or the pseudo lip of the pocket. We need a little pressing next. The pressing is required on the top part of the jacket. The pocket must extend downward, and so the pocket must be pressed downward. The lip must be pressed downward toward the pocket lining. Then place the lower portion of the pocket so that the two edges, the folded edges, meet, forming the pocket. Now, if I had top stitched in red, it would look even better. At each side, pin the layers together. We'll pin it on this side so that they're matching exactly. And then we'll need to do a little bit additional sewing. Lift up the top of the jacket and stitch the lower edges of the pocket together, and of course clean finish these edges. Then machine baste the side seams together to form the pocket. On this sample I have a completed pocket, and really it was very fast to put together. Only a few rows of stitching, and I've already stitched the dart on this sample so that the pocket is enclosed on one side. Marcy's wearing our finished duplicate, the red wool jacket. We put the pocket in the side seams area of this jacket. It has a great look to it, an easy technique. When you compare it with the original pattern and the duplicate pattern, they have very comparable details. The nice part about sewing is the flexibility that we have to transfer one pattern idea to another. I hope you'll consider some of these in some future projects. The sewing segments of this third program of designer duplicates, I detailed obviously some different techniques. When serging, I'd like to review how to wrap corners. The key that I have found in working with this is to use thread fuse, the melt adhesive thread that is sensitive to heat and moisture and will bond fabric to fabric. When sewing the edges of the vest or collars or cuffs, in this instance the vest edges, I have serged the edges with the thread fuse in the lower looper, and this edge has been pressed and it adheres very tightly to this area. Then when serging the next section, fold the fabric along the needle line and serge the next edge, making certain that the serger thread, the thread fuse, is on the interfacing side. And you'll get great wrap corners, a terrific look. This wraps up our videotape and designer duplicates. I hope you've enjoyed our combination of originals and duplicates and that you'll be encouraged to make some of these changes when you're sewing at home.
This how-to videotape has been brought to you in part by PFAFF, simply the best European line of sewing machines. By Pellon, quality products by Freudenberg. By Ginger, a tradition of quality in scissors and shears. By the McCall Pattern Company, the most fashionable name in contemporary home sewing patterns. And by Nancy's Notions Sewing Catalog, featuring specialty sewing books and notions.